Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing well.
Good.
And anxious to proceed with our program today.
Yes.
I want to talk about Iran. We've talked about Iran frequently because it's always in the news, and we're always seem to be trying to stir up trouble. But it's just not recent. It's just not this administration. When you think about our conflict with the Iranian, I sort of think of it back to when I was in high school.
Amazing.
You know, in 1953, not
Yeah.
that I was very much aware of our committing that coup against an elected leader in Iran and putting in the Shah. And there's been up and downs ever since with our relationship. But what brought it in the news this week was that, you know, because we got out of that treaty, the nuclear treaty with them, we had to punish them. So what do? We're the tough guys. We'll put sanctions on the Iranian people. No, we're not putting them on the leadership. They don't suffer. We put them on to make sure they don't get to import medicine, food, agricultural products, and parts for their commercial airlines. You know, because I don't know why. You know, it's just, to me, it's almost like out of meanness. But anyway, they don't accept the beliefs that we have that we should be trading and talking and being friends with people who are potential enemies rather than trying to precipitate a fight. But you know, in 1953, we had a Secretary of State by the name of John Foster Dulles, and he and others were behind this, and they, you know, started the whole thing off, and it continues. But the Iranians are unhappy with these sanctions. They're vicious, mean. So what can they do? I mean, a domineering country comes over here and signs a treaty, then rejects the treaty, puts on sanctions, try to starve their kids. So what they did, they took it to the United Nations, to a court, and say, hey, look, this is unfair. There's something not nice about this, and we're supposed to be in this international body, so what can you do? So they had a court hearing. And unanimously, they agreed with the Iranians, with Iran. So, well, we can't tell that it's Iran's fault no matter what. So our Secretary of State, you know, followed along the path that was established back in '53. Iran must go. We must own it. And Pompeo comes up, and he just out of spite cancels a treaty of 1955. It was called a Treaty of Amity, a friendship treaty. Doesn't sound like a bad idea. I mean, that was better than what the UN has done, like starting wars around the world. But okay, he cancels it and blames the Iranians for this. And Pompeo, you know, did this. You know, I think just out of spite, But what we're doing now, I think we're following a policy of anti-humanitarianism. But it's a drastic move, and the treaty actually was set up, you know, after we installed our dictator, the Shah of Iran. You know, he was in there, and you know his record on civil liberties was not all that great.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, this is where we are. It seems to be incessant. Policies never change. It almost makes me think that there's some group of people outside of the Republican and the Democratic Party and outside of government that seems to have a lot of controls all the way back to 1953 because the policies remain the same. Now, the problems didn't change even under a Democratic president like Obama. The policies always stay the same. So this is something I think is so unnecessary and detrimental, and it cannot be justified because we do it for our national security purposes. And I think the chance of it's all about oil might apply to this.
Yeah, and you know, John Bolton, who's the national security advisor to President Trump, he blasted the decision by the International Court of Justice, but he more importantly, he blasted Iran for even bringing it up to the court. He said even bringing it up is an abuse of the court. So he's angry that they even took it up. The timeline is important. You know, at 53, the CIA overthrew their government. It took them from 53, living through a dictatorship, to 79, to overthrow that government in '79, and that treaty was still in place after that, and it continued. Probably nobody really noticed about it. And so the U.S. pulls out of the nuclear deal in June, as President Trump promised he would, and then the automatic reimposition of sanctions when he did that. So Iran dusts off this treaty and says, hey, this is a violation. The IAEA has shown that we're completely in compliance with the Iran deal, so there's no basis for you to reimpose these sanctions. So they open up a court case, and the International Court of Justice rules partially for Iran. They didn't give Iran everything they wanted, although it's a preliminary ruling, there may be more. So basically what the U.S. says is, okay, well, stuff it. Stuff the treaty, stuff it all. We'll take our toys and go home. And when I started thinking about this is, you know, you see it over and over among U.S. Bureaucrats, diplomats, administration officials. Other countries must abide by the rules-based international order, you know. And well, I'm certainly, you know, your fans know that you're not a big fan of the UN telling us what to do. But what we have is a situation that's such hypocrisy, because on the one hand we demand the rules-based international order, but when that same international order rules against us, we say, take a hike, we're going home.
Yeah, and we wonder sometimes why there's an anti-American effort and a spirit around the world. But you know, the other thing that they always chime in with is Iran is the enemy because they are the worst sponsors of terrorism. They commit more terrorism around the world than anybody else. They're top dog.
Yeah.
And they're not angels. We know that. But what I notice is usually when they get involved, that might be near their borders, but it's not in Florida or in Texas or someplace like that. But they use it as an excuse because they are the greatest sponsors of terrorism. They're on their way, just like Saddam Hussein. They're on their way. He's on his way to get to us. And I would think that a point of hypocrisy here is if they keep chanting that they're the greatest sponsors of terrorism, have they ever checked the record of Saudi Arabia? I think they've had some infractions on the way they have acted, and here, but we're partners with them in something. If you talk about terroristic warfare, I mean, and the destruction of a country, look at Yemen. And we can't duck this because we hire people out, you know, to do our job. But, you know, to pay for it and buy the weapons and orchestrate it and give them the information, we're still guilty of that. And yet at the same time, they're able to paint Iran with the label the worst terrorist nation ever. You know, I think there were some shots fired in Basra.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody was killed or something. And then there was a Baghdad episode too. But it's sort of like, you know, some of the charges against Russia. Russia did it. Oh, we know they did it. And I think maybe I don't know that they didn't do it, but I think that this is manufactured information in order to build up this effort to feed it to the American people. If they hear about it, well, these are bad people, and we have to stop them. But they never stop and say, well, where did these terrorists come from in 9/11?
Yeah.
I think Saudi Arabia had a contribution there. I don't think Iran did. I think Iran wanted to help us after 9/11.
That's true. Indeed, they did. And the thing is, if you look at our policy in the Middle East, there is no way it's in the U.S. interest to confront Iran, because what we're doing is we're not following a pro-U.S. foreign policy. We have no interest in it. What we're doing is we're doing the bidding of Saudi Arabia and Israel. Both of them want the U.S. to be the big dog to take on Iran, which they feel threatened by. Well, if they feel threatened by Iran, it's their business to deal with it, not to send billions of our dollars, potentially thousands of soldiers, potentially a retaliatory attack against the U.S. Or our interests overseas. We're doing all this for something that is not in our interest in any way, shape, or form.
And you know, the more we look at that situation, the more we come to realize, and I think it's been known, that Iran is the subject of what's going on in Syria. You know, because they are involved, but they're very, very close to Iran, and the Kurds are involved there, so Iran is involved. But this document that came out, to me it was astounding, written by the U.S. Marine Corps back in 2011 an analysis of what was going on in Syria, and the planning is. It demolished this whole argument that there was a spontaneous uprising of people who were tired of Assad. This was all manufactured, and we rushed in there, Republicans and Democrats alike, really with no significant debate. The presidents keep endorsing it, no matter who's president, and we find out that the effort. The goal was to stop Iran. It was still anti-Iran that motivated this to get rid of Assad, and it is connected because so much of our policy is driven that way, and we've given the president credit for this. He's very consistently opposed to whatever Iran does. It's wrong.
Yeah. This was a shocking document, and it was uncovered by an investigative reporter who published it in the very respected journal Le Monde Diplomatique, where he found a U.S. Marine Corps policy paper, intelligence paper, assessing in 2011 the possibility, this is just 3 months after the original unrest started, the possibility of the overthrow of the Assad government. And according to this document, and WikiLeaks is the source of the document, according to this document, the U.S. did not envision victory for democratic opposition, but it hoped to create sufficient pressure for a coup from within. So they knew, our intelligence community assessed from the very beginning that these so-called democratic forces, they're not going to overthrow the Assad government. It's not going to happen. But what we can do is create as much chaos as possible and hope for an internal coup.
And I think there was the admission there that the so-called spontaneous protests were off stage. That was recognized, but also I think they've made predictions in there that if we did get involved in that, didn't the document say it would be long-lasting and essentially fail? But that was irrelevant because their goal was mainly to attack Iran.
And the other thing that it pointed out is the importance of having more radicalized groups, the Islamist groups. And you could say, well, this is one document, U.S. Marine Corps intelligence. What's the big deal? Just maybe some guy doodling. But it actually really coincides with something that we've talked about on the show before, which is another WikiLeaks document from 2005, 2006, which was a U.S. Embassy cable from the U.S. Embassy in Damascus back to Main State in Washington, saying essentially the exact same thing. We want to overthrow Assad. Here's how we do it. We've got to radicalize Islamists in the countryside. That's going to be the source of the overthrow. So this is a consistent policy, and as you suggested earlier, this is a consistent policy not only now in the Trump administration, but it's consistent from the Obama administration when the 2011 Marine Corps document, but also the Bush administration from 2005, 2006. This is a continuity of the U.S. policy, and as you say, it's all about Iran.
Yeah, that's for sure. And there doesn't seem to be any change in this because they've endorsed this policy, and the blame has to be placed on them. But it's something that isn't going to end until we change the overall policy, and we accept this policy. And the statements that we have made so frequently over the last few months has always been to make a point and try to alert people we're not on the right side. We were aligning ourselves and helping the radical Al-Qaeda type groups.
Yeah.
And but that goes along with the original plan. The original plan was to do that, and it was anti-Assad and anti-Iran.
And you think we learned because remember in the 80s we did the same thing in Afghanistan. Remember Brzezinski? I forget the quote, but it was a great quote. He's the one who founded the Mujahideen, which became Al-Qaeda, gave them U.S. support. He said, what's the big deal with a bunch of stirred up Muslims when we're going to take down the Soviet Union? So this is the same U.S. policy that we've had since the 70s and 80s that we're still rehashing. It's failed every single time, yet it's still the policy because the neocons are still doing it.
Yeah, but what is amazing about Brzezinski is when he was called on about this horrible, horrible mistake. I absolutely defend this. This is what brought down the Soviet system, and we should be rewarded. And here we are still fighting him, and it probably led to things like 9/11 and everything else, as if it was good policy. So that, of course, is what we're in the business of, is talking about policy ramifications, unintended consequences, and blowback to try to give some practical reasons not to do it. There are some theoretical reasons because it's nice to have peace, but it doesn't achieve what they're wanting, and they want power and control. And look at the chaos. And of course, the big picture is the money it spends. You know, we're up to about $6 trillion for all this intervention that we've been involved in the Middle East. So it's a real tragedy.
A lot of Brzezinski types made a lot of money from the military-industrial complex. Well, I would, if you're ready to go ahead and close out, I would close with a quote from the original article in Le Monde Diplomatique, because I think it's difficult for us as Americans to understand, maybe to accept, the level of criminality among those people in Washington who run our foreign policy. But this is absolutely astonishing, the level of cynicism and criminality. This is an acceptance that we have to destroy Syria, we have to blow up Syria because we got to get at Iran. And when you think about 500,000 people dead in this war in Syria, you think about the blood on how many hands. But here's a quote, and this lays the whole thing out, I think. He said, this is the writer who uncovered this document. Despite acknowledging that opposition groups would probably fail to overthrow Assad, the document still assesses that they could be mobilized to counter Iranian encroachment. It was accepted that this would empower Islamist forces among Syrian opposition over secular ones. So they knew all along what they were doing, the ramifications, and they went along with it anyway. It's very disgusting.
You know, in 2011, when the so-called spontaneous revolution started, Obama spoke out about it, and he gave it some support. But he didn't say Assad has to go and we shouldn't be participating. He says there should be reform. Look at how these people are suffering and this sort of thing. Give it, some moral support. But it was a couple years later that he announced that is the policy. Assad has to go. And I think Hillary might have been involved a little bit at that time, but she had her experience in Libya. She did such a good job there. So we promote her to go up there and deal with Syria. But once again, your point, they don't care. They never learn. It just goes on and on. And if it is money being spent and maybe guiding oil markets, their idea of success is 100% different than our idea of success, and that's probably why they talk to themselves and say, "Hey, we've just had success," like this. So it's a real shame that we haven't been more successful in introducing more people into the ideas of non-intervention, especially what we're talking about here is in foreign policy. But my experience in the last 10 years of being involved very much in foreign policy is that when I talk to young people, most young people I talk to, they don't like these wars, and they will receive a message of non-intervention and one of trying to promote peace and prosperity. So it's not like it's an idea that is so radical that people are going to reject it. The radicals are in charge, and we have to point this out, whether it's radical spending, trillions of dollars a year that we don't have, or invasion of our personal privacy, or in being involved in these wars that make no sense. So I would say that I have hope that the next generation, and I want to encourage it, more people get involved. The big thing I worry about is the transition, because this system that we have today, the financial system, our foreign policy and our trade policy, as good as it looks today for a lot of people, it isn't going to work forever because we're throwing our weight around and we're overstepping our bounds. The dollar will be vulnerable. So the big question is, there will be a transition. We will have to change it. It could get worse, which I'm betting against, but it has to get better. But it does not get better unless you have a group of intellectuals talking about philosophy and ideas, and that is why it's so important for young people to understand what liberty is all about and how the free market works and why the Fed doesn't make any sense, and why us being involved in 170 countries on our work makes no sense whatsoever. That is not the way to achieve peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.